as it is advertised, it's about gluten, and we're aware that this is controversial, and that's how I was going to start this off, talking about the controversy. But I feel the British government has outdone me on that word today. But anyway, that's another matter altogether. There seems to be a big spectrum with gluten, with people at one end thinking that you should never have it, it's evil and it's very bad for you. And right at the other end, people assuming that if you don't have it, then you're missing something really essential in your diet. So there's that whole spectrum of people and anything in between, really. Do you know? I don't know if you want to know, Joy, but your microphone's on us, okay? We're somewhere in the middle, in a comfortable middle position, just so that you know before we get going. One of us, me in fact, has to avoid gluten, and one of us, Graham, does not. So we're not going to be sitting here telling you that you absolutely must avoid gluten or that you absolutely must have it. It's not going to be like that at all. We want to present the information as we know it. We've gone into quite a lot of detail, but we'll try to keep it simple about what the issues are and how they relate as well to people with fatigue-related conditions. So let's get started, and Graham's going to explain to you exactly what gluten is.
I was just going to say, I'm going to explain to you exactly what gluten is. So gluten is it's a group of proteins actually found in certain true grains, what we describe true grains, which are members of, for the botanists amongst you, of the Poaceae family. And broadly speaking, those proteins split into two main proteins, glutenin and gliadin. Now, which of those two do you think causes the problem for some people? Any ideas?
You don't.
Okay. It's just allow. Yeah. Okay, you don't need to unmute if you don't want to, but we'll throw that question out there, and you've got your own ideas, I'm sure. So actually, it's not glutenin; it's actually gliadin. So where do we find these? What do we mean by true grains? Which grains are we talking about? Which are the gluten-containing grains? And we're talking about wheat and all its different forms. So things like spelt kamut, for example, as a type of wheat. Emmer. We've also got things like corsan, which is an ancient kind. Einkorn, another ancient wheat. Also rye, barley. Triticale, or I never quite know how to pronounce that one, but that's a combination, we think, of wheat and rye, I believe.
We've also seen wheat and barley.
So wheat, yeah, we're not quite sure.
Not clear.
Couscous, semolina. So those really are the main culprits, I guess you could say.
And that means that it's a good idea to have a look at where it's actually found. And some of these are reasonably obvious, I would think. I don't think anybody would be surprised to find that it's in bread. Bread is made, traditionally, most of our bread is made of wheat. So, of course, it's got gluten in it. This one's less obvious because it's not this, it's not the sushi, it's the soy sauce. Soy sauce contains wheat as well, and that was an error I made, is one of the reasons I wanted to include it here. If you actually choose tamari instead, then you're doing without the wheat, and it tastes pretty much the same. So tamari is safe for those who don't want gluten. Soy sauce is not. This is a controversial one, of course, because if you need to avoid gluten, you're going to have to really think about what you're drinking alcohol-wise, if you drink alcohol.
Well, more beer, really,
yeah,
isn't
and
it?
there's going to need to, beer is going to be the one to let go of or change in some way to think about. They do it, gluten-free beers do exist. Crackers and the like, typically made of wheat, so again, they contain gluten, as does pasta. Now then, what do we've also got over here all sorts of confectionery, biscuits and so on, usually made of wheat. So again, gluten containing, as is pastry and so on. They're fairly obvious. I think Graham knows of one or two more that.
Well, there's pasta there as well, of course.
Yeah.
So anything that's been made with flour from the wheat family, from rye, etc., as we've talked about. Other things that might fall under the radar for some people is things like certain sauces, dressings that you buy in the store, things like gravy mix, for example, which of course is made from flour.
Sausages.
And sausages, yeah, often things like sausages have them in because they have kind of certain bread breadcrumbs in, etc. And it's an ingredient in lots of different things that where you might not possibly expect to find it. So that's why it's so important that if you have an issue with gluten, that you do check the labels. Wheat starch, for example, would be an issue. It's given a lot of different names, so you really do need to look carefully if you have a real problem with it.
And we're going to have a look at who does have a problem, who must avoid it. So you deal with that one.
Yes, so if you have a problem with gluten, it may be because you suffer with celiac disease. It's reckoned that about 1% of the population actually suffers from celiac, and it can be quite a debilitating disease. It means that you absolutely have to avoid gluten. What is it? It's an autoimmune disorder. It's where really your immune system starts to turn against you, and it's particularly problematic within the digestive tract. It causes atrophy of the villi. So atrophy, we mean it's just something that it no longer functions properly, like muscles that atrophy when they become weak. The villi are the small filter protrusions on your intestines, which absorb nutrients into your bloodstream. And if they're affected, which they are in people with celiac disease potentially, it can affect your absorption of vitamins and minerals. So it can therefore lead to problems with mineral and vitamin deficiencies. And we've mentioned the number on the slide there. It's all of the common vitamins. Iron can cause anemia if you've got a problem with the digestion through having celiac. It can also cause really unpleasant side effects, bloating, diarrhea, and quite a lot of cramping, a lot of other symptoms as well. And if you've still not been diagnosed with celiac disease, and it may be that you don't even realize that you've got a problem with gluten. And we'll come on to also what it might be, because it might not be gluten. We'll say that at this stage. It might be something else within the foods that you're eating. But if you are having problems and you suspect it may be the gluten that's a problem, it's worth getting a diagnosis, and then your doctor or GP would need to then arrange for an internal biopsy and blood antibody tests to see whether you are actually tested positive as celiac.
But celiac isn't the only problem that can be caused by gluten, and increasingly we're hearing of people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, where the symptoms may be very similar to gluten, celiac in particular. However, the biopsy or antibody test will come back as normal. So there's nothing that the doctor can provide you that gives you a conclusive yes to that one. And the only way you generally can find out is by excluding all gluten-containing foods for a certain amount of time. Now, what length of time that would be, I don't know, but you would, if you felt you'd noticed something fairly early on, it would give you an indication, and then any reintroduction, if there's a flare-up, then you've probably got a good idea of the fact that you may have some issue with those types of foods. Beyond the celiac-related symptoms that we've mentioned there's also joint and muscle pain, can be one, but that can be caused by other things. Leg and arm numbness, bloating, Graham's already mentioned, a rash, and neurological symptoms. Now that one is particularly interesting to me because that's the one that I experienced. And it came for the first time when I had chronic fatigue, which I find interesting. So I think because of that, we really needed to go looking and seeing if there's any link to people with fatigue-related conditions and gluten. And increasingly in the scientific literature, it would suggest that there might be. Now, this doesn't mean that every single person who has chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia is inevitably going to have a problem with gluten. It really doesn't mean that. But it may be something to consider, because, for example, this first study that we've highlighted, and there's certainly more than these two, it was actually found that there was a reason to classify it as a cause of fibromyalgia, which is fairly, that was quite major. That took me by surprise. I didn't expect that. This is actually in a rheumatology paper, and it's really highlighting one case study, but of course they've drawn on other information to put it all together. And then the second one there is talking about chronic fatigue syndrome. And this is interesting because they're saying that there may be a subset of patients who have sensitivity to wheat and related cereals. And this isn't celiac disease. Now, what's interesting here is they don't, in any part of the study that I've seen so far, and I haven't paid for the big one, but it's big enough and long enough to actually read enough of the information. And there's absolutely no reference at all to gluten. So the conclusion here is that it's something about wheat. That may be the gluten, or it may be something else. And we're going to have a brief look at wheat as well, just to clarify that. But there's a little bit more to be said still on what happens if you don't have immediate symptoms. So this one's yours, Graham.
So if you're intolerant to gluten, it may actually not be immediately obvious that you are, because sometimes it can produce symptoms any time up to 5 days after the offending article that you've eaten. So, I mean, why would we then think, if we've eaten something 5 days ago that's then given us a problem today, why would we necessarily put that together? We wouldn't. It could also be immediately. So it's sometimes very difficult to pinpoint. And that's the nature of the beast often with these intolerances and with gluten. Why might it be a problem for us? Well, as a species, we only really started cultivating grains around 10,000 years ago. I know that sounds like a long period of time ago, but actually in an evolutionary perspective, it's not particularly a long time. It's considered relatively recent. And therefore, it may be that we've just not evolved yet to be able to deal, or at least some of us, depending on our genetic makeup or etc., a number of different factors, we may not be able to deal with it as easily as some other people. And we see that with things like lactose intolerance, where a good deal of the world's population doesn't have the lactase enzyme, at least after entering into adulthood, and therefore they become intolerant to lactose and can't have dairy. So it may be something to that. So we really don't know. There's possibly more to it.
And one of the things that might be relevant is actually looking at the wheat grain itself, and specifically wheat, because it's had more done to it in the past couple of centuries than any of the other grains. It is highly nutritious, but we've really altered it, we've hybridized it, and we've modified it to increase the yield. So as far as I'm aware, that's meant increasing the head size in order to make sure there are more of the seeds there. And if I've got this correct, that led to a heavy crop, if you like, or heavy plant that was top heavy then and fell over, which meant modifying it again to strengthen the stalk. Well, these two things are each going to impact on the nature of this plant. It's suddenly changed. It's not what we're used to, and that may produce its own difficulties in us digesting it. Bear in mind too that because we use wheat so extensively, and we know this is a big deal at the moment. We know that there's an issue with wheat because so much of it comes from Ukraine, and so that's quite a current issue anyway. But we are so dependent on it. We don't just feed humans, we feed livestock, which then goes on to provide food for humans. So if you have a problem with gluten, would it pass through, say, into dairy products? And I literally don't know, but just in case anybody finds they have an issue with that, it could well be lactose, but it maybe, I don't know, could it be gluten? It's something to just bear in mind so that you're making evaluations that work for you. And then on top of that, because it's such an important crop, we can't afford for it to be destroyed by pests and fungus and so on. So it's covered in pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. Of course, these things are designed to kill these little microbes in the case of the pests. And if it can kill these little microbes that we can see with the naked eye, then my guess is that it probably doesn't do a great deal of good for the microbes in the microbiome, which are tiny and microscopic. It can probably do a bit of a job on them, and that's not going to be healthy for us either. Added to that, we tend to grow it in poor soil nowadays. The health of the soil is substandard and doesn't have time to recover, for one thing, but also there's nitrogen fertilizers used. So all in all, my personal recommendation would be, this is definitely me talking, this is not an overall health recommendation, but I would definitely avoid conventional wheat. I think it's probably, if you're trying to recover from an illness of some kind, don't add in any challenges by virtue of poor quality wheat. That's my opinion. I'll stress that again. Okay, now this is really interesting too, something about bread.
So is modern bread good for us? It's something that's really helps to feed the nation through history. And bread is one of the things that most of us tend to crave at some part in our life, maybe throughout our life. And certainly we wouldn't say don't eat bread, but there is bread and bread. And what we see in the supermarket today in the plastic bags, and the first picture, the top picture there, the white sliced loaf, is extremely, it's masquerading as bread. It really is so far away from the type of bread that we would have eaten perhaps 50 years ago and before. It's so utterly refined, and it really isn't something that has much to recommend it. The reason that it's become like this is that a new bread process was introduced back in the 1960s called the Chorleywood bread process. And what this did was it allowed bread to be made very, very quickly. It had a really fast turnaround time. So it was basically much more profitable for the manufacturers. They could do much more in terms of volume. They could get it to the stores and the outlets very quickly, and it was cheaper. The problem is that it really completely changed the structure of the bread. So rather than having a bread which is allowed to ferment as all good bread should over a period of 2 days or so, everything was speeded up. So the fermentation process was not allowed to really kind of finish. So they started adding other things to the bread to offset the lack of the time they're given to the fermentation. So it was pumped full of yeast, water, etc., and also things like hydrogenated fat, which gave it a kind of structure and a fluffiness. Now, if you think about the fact that yeast can also lead to some other potential conditions, things like thrush and candida, is that really something that we want to eat? I mean, again, there's question marks over whether bread is really good for us in its modern state. So we would really recommend, if there's a chance, to either source your bread from a good artisan bread maker where you know that they employ the traditional bread making techniques. We live in Germany, which we've kind of identified quite a lot of those like master bread makers, which we appreciate, although we don't eat bread that often, but when we do, we actually really appreciate it.
And I get gluten-free.
And we get gluten-free. Or if you have a bread maker and you like making your own bread, or even if you just like doing it in the traditional way, which is something I love doing, or used to love doing, then it's so much better to do it. Give it time to prove, give it time to ferment, and it will be altogether much more digestible. Even if you don't have a problem with wheat or gluten, you may find a lot of people find that bread does actually bloat them just because it's something that maybe they're not able to digest as easily. It might not be down to those grains. It might be down to other things. But it is so much better if you allow it to ferment.
I will just add as well that the bread Graham used to make was a lovely sourdough, often with rye or one of the other grains, not wheat. Beautiful tasting bread, and we didn't need to add salt to it. And that's not the case for the white bread that you see up there. It does have quite a lot of salt added, even though they've reduced it in recent years. It's still quite a salty product in order to taste okay.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well, because I mentioned about the fermentation process, and fermentation also gives taste to bread. And if you're not fermenting it over a longer period of time, that taste then it becomes much more bland, and therefore they started adding more salt to the bread as well. So it's not just gluten, it's a lot of different factors, but of course the workshop is primarily here about gluten and whether we should avoid it, so we'll focus on that.
So if you do need to avoid it or think you might, obviously you need a few strategies for what to do about it. So that's what this little section is about here, what's coming up, the things that do exist that you can use. Now, if you particularly want the true grain still, the member of that Poaceae family that Graham mentioned right at the beginning, there are still some others that do contain the gluten in, and that's not the problem one, but they don't contain the gliadin. That is the problem one. And those listed there, the oats, corn, rice, teff, and millet, they all classify as gluten-free. Now, it is the case for some people, it's a fairly modest number of people who still have a problem with the oats because the protein in the oats is also problematic to them. It's called avenin. And the majority of people don't have a problem with that. It's also worth mentioning that you often get the choice of buying gluten-free oats or not. Well, if your issue is a sensitivity rather than celiac disease, there's a very good chance that you're fine with absolutely any of the oats, because the oats never contain gluten. What happens is some oats are processed in a plant where gluten containing products are made, and therefore they can get contaminated, but it's modest, you're not taking much in. So if it's a sensitivity, you're unlikely to notice any difference. So they're all gluten-free, they're all true grains, and they should be okay for most people. But there are also some other types of grains. They're known as pseudo grains because they don't belong to this family, but they can be used in very similar ways to some of the other grains. And the pictures we've got there are of buckwheat, first of all, which I must admit I've never eaten cooked. I don't know what it tastes like. Quinoa, very easy to cook, can be all white, or can be this tricolor one that we've got pictured here. And amaranth, these are all completely gluten-free. These are almost exclusively without problems of that kind. I'm not aware of any difficulty with those. So they're all going to be a possibility.
What I would say is that we have actually eaten buckwheat cooked, but in the form of a bread.
Oh, that's true.
We've had baked bread, so
like
it's often used as a, in bread for people that can't eat gluten.
That's true.
We wanted to also say about amaranth. If you've never tried amaranth, we find it an incredible little grain or seed. It goes quite stodgy when you cook it, and I can tell you it's a really nice comfort food, particularly in the winter. It's almost like forms like a slightly like a dumpling, and I really recommend it, and it's extremely nutritious, as is quinoa and buckwheat, but amaranth is possibly least known of those three.
Yeah. Okay, these next two are yours.
Yeah.
What do we do if we're going for
gluten-free
products?
Okay, so we've got a problem with gluten, or we think we might have a problem, or we just want to avoid it because we think that's the right thing to do, and it's completely up to the individual. We've laid out where we think, where we are. Don't go alone. Take discernment with you, because one of the criticisms of people going on gluten-free diets, and a lot of people do it as a fad because they think that gluten is bad full stop, even if it doesn't cause a problem for them personally. They just want to go without gluten because gluten is bad for you. Actually, we're not saying that. It isn't, unless you have a problem. And therefore, what happens if you go gluten-free is, because you tend to then remove a lot of the kind of whole foods or grains from your diet, which come with really, really important vitamins and minerals and other plant compounds, you're then swapping them for something which is very often very heavily processed, has a lot of added salt, sugar, and fat to make up for the lack of gluten, because gluten has a texture, and it has a texture. It helps to bring something together to make it a much more pleasant sensation in the mouth. And therefore, if you're making something, if a company is making something that's gluten-free, to attract people to buy it, they try and reconstruct that that pleasurable feeling in the mouth with adding a lot of stuff that you really don't want to be eating, and is very, very low in vitamins and minerals. And what happens sometimes is that people then become deficient because they're focusing on this these gluten-free products, which really are only there because there's a gap in the market, and companies say, right, let's give people that because there is demand for it. Now, we're not saying that it's wrong to get these things, but you just really need to be careful which ones you choose. And really, you're best to actually focus where you can on whole foods, so that you know exactly what you're getting. You don't have to wonder every time you look at the label, has it got gluten in, has it not, what else has it got in it, what is that? So that is something really that we feel is worth bearing in mind.
So what about bread?
So with regards to bread, I think we've already really covered this on a previous slide. Make sure that you do know the product you're buying intimately. And I think that Annette she often recounts a story, don't you, where you went into a supermarket. Do you want to tell that story?
I will do actually, yes, because there's I think at the time I was avoiding lactose, and it was very early in my it was probably about 20 years ago almost, and I was aware that when I picked up a loaf of bread in the supermarket, sometimes it had milk powder in. So I thought, oh, bread can sometimes contain milk. So this was nothing to do with gluten. However, I went into the supermarket one day and I had that lovely smell of fresh bread. Well, yeah, fresh bread, that's what I'll get. That's only going to have flour and water in, surely, and maybe some yeast. And of course, there's no ingredients listed on fresh bread. So I thought I'd go and ask. So I went to both in Tesco and in Morrison's. I remember going to ask the very nice gentleman in the bakery if they could tell me if there was any dairy in it. Really, I think that's what I was asking for, and they didn't know. And each time they didn't know, so they went to the back of the store and got the ingredients list out for me, and I was horrified. It was a list as long as my arm of ingredients, most of which I'd never heard of, and most definitely would never have had in my kitchen because I didn't know what they were. So it didn't matter whether it had lactose in or not. I was not going to have it because it was just not what I expected. I didn't realize that these breads are made sometimes as much as a year before and just finished baked in store to make it seem like a freshly baked product. So a little bit cynical. They pump out that lovely smell and they're giving you something that's actually nowhere near as fresh as you think, not nutritious, and full of what I would classify as anti-nutrients. So supermarket bread for me is absolutely out unless it can prove itself to be very, very competent as a bread, and it typically isn't.
And prove is the word there, because if you make your own, you know it intimately, and generally speaking, when you're making bread, it should have 3 or 4 ingredients: water, flour, yeast, possibly salt if you want to add it, and any seeds, etc. if you want to put them in as well. And that's really all it should have. There's a photograph there of a loaf that I actually made when we realized that Annette was having a problem with gluten. So I had to stop making my sourdough spelt rye bread, and instead made a bread that consists of, it has oats in it, that was the grain we used, and then lots of seeds: pumpkin seeds, flax seeds, chia seeds, sunflower seeds, sesame seeds, you name it, and mixed together with water, and a little bit of molasses actually to give it a little bit of sweetness and stickiness, and water. I think I've said water. Let it soak overnight, so it all kind of was like a glutinous mass. And notice how I use the word glutinous there. Gluten comes from, we've named gluten because it's like glue, but this didn't have any gluten in. And then just formed it into a loaf shape. And because it's quite rigid, it didn't actually just sag. It's got no yeast in it. It was just seed bread. Baked it in the oven for about half an hour. Took it out of the tin, turned it over upside down so that the bottom got done for about another 20 minutes, and it came out perfectly, and it's absolutely brilliant. So very, very filling, very nutritious. Can really recommend it. The one in the middle is raw bread. Now you look at that and you might think, raw bread, what are you talking about? You can't eat raw bread. This was actually a bit of a party piece for us when we used to give raw food lunches, because we actually mixed this with things like carrots and courgette and a few seeds. I think we used coconut flour, didn't we, as well? And formed it into a loaf shape, and then put it on a dehydrating tray. And so we've got a dehydrating oven, and just dehydrated it overnight, and it comes out as crispy warm bread. absolutely amazing. So we realized not everyone will have a dehydrator, but it was absolutely fantastic. We really love to have this bread. And then on the right hand side, we've got some crackers, which again, they're raw crackers, dehydrated, just seeds and nuts mixed together with some, I think we use beetroot, which is why one of them's purple, and a little bit of flavoring, I think herbs and spices, and just made our own crackers. So
they could be done in an oven, I think.
Yeah, you could do those in an oven as well. But these are all things that if you want to do your own, if you're adventurous, you can do, rather than go to the supermarket and buy something there.
So the other consideration, of course, is it's not simply a case of replacing bread, for example, if that's the big draw for the wheat-based products that you typically have. But there's also the issue of nutrition, and it's a big issue as well, because all whole grains have a really excellent nutrient profile. And if you're cutting them out for whatever reason, then you really need to take that on board, and it can be done. So there is no absolute necessity to have grains in your diet, but it needs a bit of planning. So if at the moment in particular, if refined grains especially are dominant for you, if there's something that you have frequently and you realize that's probably not a good idea, this might be the perfect opportunity to scale up your nutrition, to try doing something different, to look in different directions and have a bit of a rethink. And I know that's a challenge, because I know that I'll go back to the example of me giving up dairy when I needed to do that, and suddenly it's like, what am I going to do about breakfast? What am I going to put on my cereal before I have my toast with butter? And because that was my fixated idea of what breakfast had to be, and now it's completely different. I'm having much better, more interesting breakfasts. So it may open the door to something different. It's not always bad news. If you are eating refined grains, then do bear in mind that you are losing a lot of the really good nutrition that's in the whole grain. The B vitamins are stripped down to much less than they are in a whole grain. Vitamin E, really stripped, only 5% remains. It's those minerals listed there: magnesium, zinc, potassium, iron, calcium, selenium, all down. And of course, the fiber is pretty much removed. There's almost no fiber. Now, this is really interesting to me as well. This is the sort of thing that I find fascinating. It's not a very good kind of fascinating in the context of this. We've been fortifying bread in the UK, that is, and in other countries too, but I particularly know about the details of the UK. And this has been going on since the 1950s, adding back in, look at what's missing again, B6, B2, B3, B1, B5, but we're adding in B1 and B2 only. Added to that, B1 and B3, sorry. Additionally, calcium, just the one mineral, just calcium, and iron. Sorry, two minerals, not the whole spectrum there that's listed. And that's not exhaustive either, there could be more. So 4 nutrients that have been in our bread in the UK since the 1950s. In 2021, the UK government announced that they were going to add folic acid. I can't confirm if that's there yet, simply because we haven't been into a UK supermarket to pick up a loaf of bread and find if it's there. But if it is, that's the 5th nutrient. And bearing in mind the nutrients that are missing, this is quite stark. We are being fed bread that has the nutritional knowledge of the 1950s. Do you not think that's pretty poor? I certainly do. Nutritional knowledge was low in the 1950s compared with what it is now, and we haven't updated our bread apart from to add folic acid because of the impact it has on pregnancy and children's development, very young children's development. So the issue of nutrition is really important. That does have to be taken into consideration. So
okay, so we're going to we'll have to crack on, because I noticed we've got about 5 minutes left. So oats, I think we've mentioned oats briefly. Extremely nutritious grain. They're typically minimally processed. If you look at the top picture there, you'll see oats, as most of us recognize it. They're rolled oats, which means they've been steamed and then rolled. So it does undergo a processing. And below that, you'll see the oat grains before they've been rolled and processed. They may have been heated to kill any bugs and to make them more shelf stable. But sometimes they haven't been, and we actually sprout oats as well, which means that they haven't undergone any processing or heating whatsoever. They're as they come. But anyway, whichever, you can make porridge, you can make bread. We've mentioned that. We've put it in our seed bread. Great for desserts, and also the energy balls, because they really help to bulk up with the other ingredients. So we really recommend those. Fantastic nutrition, great fiber, and good for reducing cholesterol.
This is a really good one for anybody, particularly who is heading towards a more plant-strong diet, or is already fully plant-based, because one of the minerals that can be a little bit challenging is zinc. And wild rice, which is actually a grass, it's not actually rice, but it's so similar to rice, it's classified or labeled as rice, is one of the best plant-based sources of zinc that you can find anywhere. It's absolutely superb, and it's good in other nutrients too, the B vitamins and other minerals. The only downside, and this is really unfortunate, is it's a little bit expensive, but if you can afford to give yourself this treat now and then, I strongly recommend it. Wild rice is absolutely superb.
It's got a really nice nutty taste to it, hasn't it?
Very easy.
Yeah. And of course, we're not saying that, rice like brown rice or whole grain rice also really, really good as well. We would tend to avoid the white rice, because it really is nutritionally very, very poor. Buckwheat, we've mentioned buckwheat before, great source of B vitamins and minerals, contains a couple of antioxidants, which we've spoken about in a previous class if you were on that, quercetin and rutin, which help to prolong the activity of vitamin C in our bodies. They're also good for our blood vessels, capillaries, they're anti-inflammatory, and buckwheat itself is a really high protein food. It's got an excellent protein spectrum, and it can be sprouted easily and very quickly.
And then of course there's quinoa, again really nutrient rich, great for B vitamins, and very good for some of the minerals that we know are really important, the iron, zinc, and so on. And no surprise, it can be sprouted really quickly, so quickly that I put some on last night and it's already ready. It was ready this morning. So it can be done very quickly, cooked very easily, and it's a great grain, I think, and it's getting cheaper as we're starting to actually produce it in Europe now as well. So, and I think you can buy locally grown quinoa in England, I think.
Yeah, because there's quite a bit of an issue of it causing problems in Bolivia and South America, where it was farmed, and the natives not able to have it because it's a staple food for them. And suddenly there was this huge demand from the West for quinoa. But I think, as Annette said, there's a lot more homegrown now. And
another one that comes from the same region, your favourites.
Yeah, so Amaranth I talked about earlier, great protein, really rich in lysine, which on a plant-based diet is often assumed to be more difficult to come by, but you can get enough of it if you have a varied diet. Also rich in B vitamins, minerals, excellent for iron, good for zinc, can be sprouted quickly. And this was known as a bit of a superfood, or this has got a superfood status. I think it was the Incas or the Aztecs. I always get mixed up which one it was, but they basically used to have it. It really was revered by them. So that's Amaranth.
It is. And so since we're talking so much about, again, a lot about sprouting, but I can absolutely assure you could do this with any of the cooked grains. This is just an idea of how we use them, because obviously these grains in particular, these pseudo grains, are less easy to convert into bread, although there are flours. There's buckwheat flour, there's quinoa flour, there's probably amaranth flour, I've not seen it. So it can be done. But we tend to use them directly in salads or in wraps, which we often make with a cabbage leaf or a lettuce leaf, or a nori sheet for the seaweed ones. Breakfast cereal, the buckwheat and quinoa I've had for breakfast quite frequently. And you can also, there's one here that you can buy that we haven't got a picture of. There are such things as sprouted loaves in health food shops. They're quite small, they're quite dense, and they're really varied. Some of them are really, some are a bit too firm for my liking, and some of them are really soft and lovely. Some contain gluten, and some are made with non-gluten grains, but they're all sprouted. So they're really good quality breads for a little thing that you can buy in a shop. So it's another possibility.
And just seeing soup there on the list, it's one of the things I meant to mention earlier when we were talking about where to beware how when if you're trying to avoid gluten, that a lot of shop bought soups have gluten in them as well. So that's just worth bearing in mind. So I think just to summarize, really, with regards to the gluten, we would say that do you need to avoid gluten? Well, that really depends. It depends if you have a problem with gluten. Gluten per se is not an issue. I eat gluten without it being a problem. I tend not to have much gluten in my diet because just for ease, Annette has a problem, and I tend to go for things that don't have gluten. It's easier.
Do you miss it?
I don't miss it at all. On the odd occasion, I fancy some bread, but what do? We go and buy gluten-free bread, and we know a very good bakery here that makes artisan gluten-free bread. But so don't demonize gluten per se, but just be aware that it may be causing problems. And if you do have a fatigue-related condition, there may be some link. Who knows? It's worth experimenting and perhaps even eliminating it for a period of a few weeks to see whether there's any improvements or change in your symptoms.
Okay, so I'll stop the share now.